Hey guys, this is Poohhead189, and today we're going to discuss the institution of slavery in the Elder Scrolls universe. Now, while I believe it is redundant to say that the practice is abhorrent because that's obvious, we also need to acknowledge that in fantasy, or in just fiction, let's say, horrible things are toyed with by the creators so we can ask questions safely. So, slavery, murder, rape, warfare, these things are often put in fiction so we can experience them in a way without actually having to do so in our real life. Unfortunately, in order to understand these concepts, in this case slavery, in the Elder Scrolls, we need to take a quick look at our own world. Now, there's two main differences between the slavery of our world and the slavery of the Elder Scrolls. In our world, slavery can range from indentured servitude to lifelong chattel slavery, whereas in the Elder Scrolls, it's almost always the latter. And secondly, in the Elder Scrolls, slavery tends to be always based upon race. In our world, that is a relatively recent and temporary phenomenon. Now, in popular culture, it's usually portrayed as a purely racial thing, particularly in America. However, slavery has been around and prevalent in our world since before civilization could truly have been said to have begun, ranging back to the Mesolithic during the Late Ice Age, around 13,000 years ago. Typically, as long as someone believes they are superior to someone else, due to their size, religion, country, language, and for a few hundred years, skin color, they will enslave and exploit others. For the longest time, prejudice and slavery was based on language and culture rather than race. The Romans would enslave the Celts, the Egyptians would enslave the Jews, the Vikings would enslave the Slavs and the mainland Europeans, all due to their language and culture. However, in a lot of fantasy settings, and most assuredly in Elder Scrolls, language and culture and religion are tied to race for the most part. And so, someone's race is a much more reliable way to know someone in the Elder Scrolls than in our more mundane ideas of race in our world. For instance, if you walk up to someone who is white or brown or black, you won't really know the culture unless you know where they're from, or you won't know their religion unless you know where they're from, and even if you know where they're from, the religion might not be what you expect. However, while there is plenty of intermingling of culture in the more cosmopolitan areas of Tamriel, you'll still almost never find a high elf that doesn't follow the elven pantheon, and he or she will believe Lorkhan is a vile trickster. Whereas if you bump into an Argonian, 99 times out of 100, they will staunchly revere the Hist. And just like in most fantasy universes, different species or races with different cultures, languages, and even biological makeup beyond some melanin will make for some extreme racial divides. And so slavery evolved on Tamriel far differently than in our world, where all of us are human, and to try and justify it, people will use dozens and dozens of reasons to say someone else is different or lesser. However, that aside, let's dive into slavery in the Elder Scrolls. Now, the institution of slavery is so prevalent in Elder Scrolls that we even have evidence of it being prominent in a previous Kalpa. And a Kalpa is a cycle of time, meaning that a Kalpa encompasses the world and all time across it, and when everything ends and is remade, that is another Kalpa. Before the world of Mundus was made, the world before was ruled by Dreg kings, and dregs are creatures. They're like crustacean-like creatures that live underwater, and some are even still around in this Kalpa. However, they are a far cry of what they once were in the world before, being tyrants and enslavers. In fact, they were so prolific in their oppression of others, the legends say the Daedric prince of slavery and tyranny, Molag Bal, was either their chief or the deity they worshipped. So that means either their chieftain was so tyrannical he became the demon god of slavery, or the Dreg race worshipped Molag Bal, the god of slavery, as their chief deity. Which brings me to the Daedric prince Molag Bal himself. He goes by many names, including, but not limited to, the Dark Father, the Father of Vampires, Lord of the Undead, the Father of Undeath, the Harvester, the Lord of Corruption, the Corrupter, the Tormentor of Men, the Corrupter of Souls, the Lord of Troubles, the Prince of Schemes, the God of Brutality, the Sower of Strife, the Lord of Rape, and most importantly, the Lord of Domination and the Slave Lord. He is the most vile being in the entire Elder Scrolls, though some might consider Mehrunes Dagon and a few other notable individuals as contenders. It's fitting that slavery is an almost holy thing to his followers, considering that is essentially what he treasures. In his realm of Cold Harbor, which is made in a mockery of Tamriel and Mundus, many souls and hapless wanderers that end up there are enslaved by Molag Bal's Daedra and a few other quote-unquote fortunate beings, though they are all still subject to Molag Bal's will in the end. Now, it's difficult to tell when exactly slavery first began on Tamriel. It's quite possible it began in the Dawn era, but that era is shrouded in so much myth we really cannot say. If not then, it's safest to bet that it occurred during the Merethic era, which is the era that happened next, and the era that happened before what is commonly called the First Era. Now, there is no shortage of times during this era where enslavement occurred. It was a time of migration and colonization, after all. Likely the most famous are the Aelids, whom I've discussed before in previous videos. These are the heartland elves of central Tamriel, who subjugated the native Nedic humans and ruled an empire of torture and enslavement. They did not single out Molag Bal as their primary deity, but I doubt you could find a civilization more akin to how Molag Bal might rule. Other evidence suggests they enslaved or displaced various beast races as well, including native birdmen who are now extinct. Other than them, however, it was unfortunately an extremely popular institution in the north. The dragon priests of the dragon cult ruled over people with an iron fist, and we cannot forget the conflict between the Atmorans and the Snow Elves. It was said by Nordic accounts that when the Snow Elves sacked Sarthal, they took human captives as slaves. This act brought about the arrival of Ysgramor and his 500 warriors, and once the Snow Elves were decimated, the remaining Snow Elves that weren't driven to the Dwemer were placed into slavery, albeit for a short period of time, to essentially build Windhelm, using their labor as recompense for past grievances. Though we do need to note that it is generally accepted they allowed the Snow Elf slaves to go free after the city was finished, so it wasn't a lifetime thing. And of course, the majority of Snow Elves that were driven out of their cities were accepted as indentured servants by the Dwemer, who actually eventually blinded them and made the surviving Snow Elves their slaves, placing them in pens. It's quite odd how the main discourse around the Snow Elves make it so the Nords are their primary foe, when their fellow elves tricked them and then enslaved them, devolving them into the Falmer. And the Falmer themselves now go out to raid and steal infants and captives for food and servants. We also need to reckon with the fact that with Elder Scrolls Online and its various DLCs or expansions, we've gotten an immense amount of information and lore about Tamriel during the Second Era. It would be difficult to decipher all of it. Much of what we have on peoples enslaving others comes from what is revealed in the game. A Khajiit cartel called the Thazar Cartel is a slavery organization founded by the Khajiit Thazara, though we should note various other races make up its ranks, so while the organization was made by Khajiit, a lot of the slavers are also non-Khajiit as well. This, along with the Dwemer subjugating the Snow Elves, does leave me to make a point. While the majority of the slavery is justified based on race, there are various peoples who will enslave whoever to make a profit, even if they are of the same race, particularly if they are a different subrace or simply just a different cultural group, much like how the Vikings or Scandinavians enslaved the Slavs and Northern Europeans to sell to other Europeans and the Abbasid Caliphate in the Middle East, or the Kingdom of Dahomey or the Igbo in Africa sold other Africans to the Europeans during the Atlantic slave trade. Sometimes their race doesn't matter, it's just a different culture, so they don't care. Another good example is the Dunmer or Dark Elves keeping orcs or Orozmer slaves, when orcs are technically elves themselves. And this is a good segue to the Bretons, who also have elvish blood, for interbreeding with their Durenni overlords, yet many were put into something very near to slavery, though they eventually became second-class citizens, and then ended up becoming the dominant force in High Rock simply by outlasting and outbreeding their Durenni ancestors and rulers. In High Rock, the Durenni elves gained a hegemony over the Nedic peoples that lived there, and while they did not practice chattel slavery necessarily, the men of the region that eventually became the Bretons had a very similar existence to many subject peoples from our world. A good comparison would be the Irish, Scots, and Welsh being oppressed by the English. They were seen as lesser, they had little to no rights, and there was actually a law in Durenni culture called the Perquisite of Coition, which allowed any Durenni elf to have sexual intercourse with any human of their choice, so it was essentially a right to their bodies, consensual or otherwise. In fact, Durenni elves would brag about how many human concubines they had, and as they began to interbreed with the humans, the more elvish blood one had, from their mixture, the more social standing they had in such a society. Eventually, the mixed-race Bretons, mostly descendants from the indentured Needs, were born. However, much like in our own history, being enslaved does not mean that you will not enslave others when given the upper hand. For a short period, there were Breton slavers on the island of Amenos, and there was a noble house in the Second Era in High Rock called the Velmont that was a part of a slave trade. We also need to remember that despite the Empire of Cyrodiil being founded on rebelling against oppressors and slave masters, during the Second Era, Queen Euroxia invaded elsewhere and bought many slaves from Sea Elf raiders, though she used many clever legal loopholes and half-speak to insist they were not slaves. So they probably used various things like debt or, like either monetary or a debt to society or whatever, which made them free labor. Of course, everyone in the Empire knew they kind of were slaves, and they were forced to mine for minerals for the Empire. Not to mention, the Siesi slaves were pivotal in forming the Second Empire, and during Tiber Septim's invasions, he allowed the Dunmer to keep their slaves as long as they paid tribute, despite it being technically illegal. And during the Battle of Sancre Tor, the battle where Tiber Septim died and ascended to godhood, the victorious Imperials sold the Breton captives they took into slavery, though I'm not entirely certain who they sold them to. Also, apparently, owning an ogre as a slave in the Empire is legal. It's not a common thing, but apparently they don't see ogres as intelligent enough to be considered sentient, and so if you have the capability, you can enslave an ogre apparently. It's odd, but it is there. Now, let's get to the big one, since we already mentioned them, the Dunmer. It seems in the Elder Scrolls, elves really like slavery. Even the High Elves during the Second Era, and potentially up to the Fourth, own goblins as slaves most commonly, though they've also had ogres, orcs, potentially humans, and sometimes even Dunmer as slaves in rare instances. However, the Dunmer themselves will enslave almost anybody. Most commonly, the Dunmer have shackled any member of any beast race, which they also consider orcs, and they will also subjugate humans, considering humans mere animals, at least for the most part, as stated during an interview for Elder Scrolls III Morrowind. It was only later during the Third Era that the Dark Elves reluctantly admitted that humans were people. However, they still took many Nord slaves in the northern parts of Morrowind, which left a bitter taste in many Nord mouths, which is one reason why the Nords in Skyrim have a very bitter look towards Dark Elves, because the Dark Elves tended to enslave them. However, as we all know, the Argonians are the most popular slaves, as they are the closest province other than Skyrim to Morrowind, and Argonians can survive and work under very harsh conditions. Obviously an allegory to the slave trade of the Caribbean, many Argonians in the south are made to pick sultries, which is very likely much like sugarcane. Now, to give a more comprehensive guide, I'll read an excerpt from the UESP on Dunmer slavery. House Dress thrived on mass abduction of Argonians and Khajiit into slavery, often with the support of local river warlords selling their own kind. Dress families worked Argonian slaves on large Saltrees plantations on the southeast coast of Morrowind, while others profited from the slave trade itself. They held thousands in their infamous slave pens of Tyr, to be shipped by smugglers to cave-holding pens on the Bitter Coast. The plantations of House Flalu nobles made widespread use of slaves as farm labor. In comparison, slavery was uncommon among the members of House Redoran, though some of their warriors used slaves, potentially, pitting them against beasts for entertainment. House Telvanni used slaves as servants for housework and as labor in mines. Towns like Molag Mar, which sounds a lot like Molag Bal, Suran, and Tel Arun had regular slave markets. Morrowind still practices slavery to the Fourth Era as far as we know, albeit these days there are more abolitionist movements like the Twin Lamps. However, swift slave ships will travel up the coast of anywhere on Tamriel to conduct a lightning raid, and while most Argonians abhor slavery, as I stated in the excerpt I read, and just like everywhere, there are small pocket groups of Argonian tribes willing to sell their brethren or anyone else into slavery to make a profit. Also, to go back to the Altmer and the Dwemer, in Morrowind we get an in-game text called the Antecedents of Dwemer Law. This is a text specifically on how Dwemer law and customs were made and influenced by Altmer or High Elf culture. I'll read an excerpt from the text itself. In short, so far as I am able to trace the order of development in the customs of the Bosmeri tribes, I believe it to have been in all ways comparable to the growth of Altmeri law. The earlier liability for slaves and animals was mainly confined to surrender, which, as in Somerset Isles, later became compensation. And what does this matter for a study of our laws today? So far as concerns the influence of the Altmeri law upon our own, especially the Altmeri law of master and servant, the evidence of it is to be found in every judgment which has been recorded for the last 500 years. It has been stated already that we still repeat the reasoning of the Altmeri magistrates, empty as it is, to the present day, and I will quickly show how Altmeri custom can be followed into the courts of the Dwemer. In the laws of Kondar Watch, it is said if one who is owned by another slays one who owns himself, the owner must pay the associates 3 fine instruments in the body of the one who is owned. There are many other similar citations, and the same principle is extended even to the case of a centurion by which a man is killed. If at the common workbench one is slain by an animunculi, the associates of the slain may disassemble the animunculi and take its parts within 30 days. So, let me boil this down. Essentially, this not only proves that the Dwemer had slaves before they disappeared, and we also know that because they took the Snow Elves as slaves, but their laws that allowed slavery came from the High Elves. And this is essentially statutes and legal reasonings on what should happen if a slave is killed and whatnot. Now, the Red Guards, though they are not usually slavers these days, were very much so once upon a time. When the Red Guards migrated to Tamriel after Yokuda's catastrophes, the waves were called the Regatta, or the wave of warriors that showed up, before they were called the Red Guards, and the Regatta did enslave the native beast races and Nedic humans of the region, thinking they deserved nothing less for their weakness. In fact, that's actually a quote. Now, the Reach folk, who are the peoples of the Forsworn, do take captives and make them slaves quite a bit, though there's not a lot of documentation on specifics. And the Bosmer, that's kind of tricky. Let me read one more part of the UESP to explain the Bosmer. Tribal Bosmer have the custom of the, quote, mourning war. After the wartime death of a tribe member, the clan responsible for their death is raided for captives. Typically only one, but if the deceased was of notable importance, multiple hostages may be taken. These captives serve as, quote, replacements for the slain Bosmer and are physically tortured for an extensive period of time. When finally mentally broken, the hostages are instead happily welcomed into the clan and mentally bewildered by this sudden change of behavior, submitting to their torturers. Typically, they're also given the possessions, position, and family of the wood elf they're replacing, though in modern times this is less common. So essentially, if two tribes fight each other and someone from one tribe kills another, what the other tribe will do will be to raid the opposite tribe, take a captive, and then torture them into thinking that they are the Bosmer that was killed and that they are now a part of their family. So it's not necessarily slavery, but it's torturous manipulation to replacement. It's very odd. Finally, we must speak of the orcs. They are quite an odd case because orcs have no record of slavery, only being enslaved. However, in the Orcish religion, they believe that once they die, their wives will be granted 1,000 slaves, each to cater to their every whim. Exactly who these slaves are, we do not know. It's very likely the orcs do not have a long history of slavery because for as long as they have been around, they have had no permanent home or civilization to call their own, and we also need to admit that while the Orcish people aren't slavers themselves, or at least they don't have an institution for it, there have been plenty of slave organizations that individual orcs have aided in or have joined. Of course, while most, though not all, of Tamriel's slavery is historical and not in the Fourth Era, though of course we don't know everything, outside of Tamriel the practice is alive and well. We don't get much information, but the Sea Elves, the Slode, and various peoples of Akavir have historically practiced slavery, and most likely do into the Fourth Era. And again, we also cannot rule out the fact that Morrowind likely still practices it, and other provinces might very well also. We simply have an extremely limited view of most provinces outside of Skyrim during the Fourth Era. And you might wonder, well, if slavery is alive and well through most of Tamriel's history, and even during the Fourth Era, how can the various nations that have abolished slavery allow it to continue? Why exactly did the Imperial Dynasty allow Morrowind to continue their slave trade, despite claiming both Morrowind and Blackmarsh, the nominal nation of the victims, as a part of the greater empire? Well, the answer is very simple, and while I'll discuss this more in an upcoming video on Star Wars and the Republic allowing slavery, I'll give a brief explanation here. The reason they allow it is because modern fantasy races tend to be human at their core. Not by blood or species, but they follow human nature. Because, well, humans write this series, and a lot of the times, if they try to take historical precedents, that's all born from human nature. And, unfortunately, human nature is often selfish and often abides by out of sight, out of mind. There are more slaves today, meaning in the real world, than there have ever been in any point of history ever. They farm the cocoa to make your chocolate, they build stadiums in Qatar for the Olympics, African slaves mine the material for the phone you use to tweet about BLM or workers' rights. And I am not saying you or I are monsters, what I'm saying is that it is human nature to be comfortable with atrocities if you benefit from it, particularly if you don't have to get such a big icky feeling by watching it. It's not right. It should be addressed. Honestly, mostly by our government. But the reason why we allow it is the same reason they allow it on Nirn and Tamriel. If someone is living in the Imperial City, Morrowind is a very, very far away place by trade cart, or by walking, or even by horse. And if things come from Morrowind that they think are neat, they're going to be like, oh, that sucks that they still have slavery, but that's just how it is. So it seems like much in our world, slavery is done by those who deem themselves superior, or those who are willing to do anything to make a profit, and others allow it if it benefits them. And it is very likely that the practice of slavery itself is something that feeds the power of Molag Bal, one of the most despicable entities in the lore of the Elder Scrolls. Now, I know this subject matter was quite heavy, but I hope you appreciated it. I hope you liked this video. It always helps if you like my videos, and commenting definitely helps. Sharing, I would also appreciate, and subscriptions would be great. If you want to see more Elder Scrolls videos, or Lord of the Rings, or Star Wars, or anything, please let me know, and I hope you guys have a great day. Thank you so much. See ya!